I would just like to shed some light on the sort of changes that we can expect as a result of these ordinances. The first, of course, is that private sector, including large multinationals, will come in as active buyers. Historically, they've been almost prevented from doing so because of the Essential Commodities Act and the storage limits that have been associated with a lot of these commodities. And in a way, the government has therefore been the only institution that's been active in procurement. But that's insufficient as these crops grow in size and as we move into surpluses. The government has resource constraints, and more importantly, it is the private sector that is capable of holding these crops, doing effective risk management, using the derivative markets, and also market these crops throughout the year. Agriculture is one sector where the production occurs for just a couple of months of the year, and the consumption occurs for all 12 months. So some entities have to store the crop, and the Essential Commodities Act was a disincentive for storage, and not only for capital to come in and buy these commodities and store them, but also for infrastructure to physically store these crops. I think that is the sort of change, that's the first change that will come in. Large corporates will bring in investments both in terms of capital and in terms of infrastructure, and buy crops, store them, and effectively market them at a national level as well as at an international level. The second major change with the arrival of the private markets is that the private markets will not function in the same way that the APMC markets are functioning in terms of the physical nature of these markets. So currently, there is a need for the buyer to physically be present at the mandi, to examine the goods, for the seller to also physically bring the goods to the mandi and offer the goods for auction. And this is a very, very time-consuming and inefficient process. I think the shift will occur to a process where the seller, at the time of the harvest itself, will move his goods into warehouses, which are possibly WDRA accredited, and he obtains, after quality testing, electronic negotiable warehouse receipt. Now, this process is independent of a purchase or sale transaction. So this process just entails conversion of a physical commodity into an electronic warehouse receipt with the trust built in on the quantity and quality of goods. Once that is completed, this negotiable warehouse receipt is available for purchase by anyone in the same location, in any location in the state, in any state in the country. And I think that's the primary difference in this local versus a national market. It's not so much of a jurisdiction issue. I think it's more of a structural issue in terms of how markets have functioned so far and the physicality associated with them versus how they will be functioning in future. And I think the only reason it will transition from a local market to a truly national and hopefully even an international market is that the buyer, without having seen the goods, trusts the validity of a negotiable warehouse receipt of a certain commodity for its weight, its quality, and the fact that it has been stored in a warehouse that's regulated. And I think this has to some extent already happened in the futures market, where the existing accredited warehouses of the exchange, of NCDEX for example, are all WDRA regulated, and all the delivery occurs using electronic negotiable warehouse receipts. So ownership gets transferred without the need of physical movement at that point in time. The buyer can then choose to move the goods to his processing plant or for exports at a point in time when he needs to shift the goods. Until then, the goods can remain at the location at which they were originally deposited, and the ownership transfer is obviously also triggered along with a financial transfer of money from the buyer to the seller. And I think this efficiency that we see in almost every other electronic platform for physical goods, whether they be books or railway tickets or grocery items, now can extend to primary or secondary trades that are associated with farmers and farmer producer organizations. I think the set of ordinances that the government has promulgated represent a sweeping change. They collectively represent a paradigm shift for how agricultural marketing will be conducted in this country. And I think it truly represents liberation for farmers who have historically been constrained by very strong regulations at a local level. This has prevented them from accessing national and even international markets on a collective basis. So I think one aspect that we need to really consider is that as a nation we have moved from serious deficits to surpluses in most crops. And I think therefore that these ordinances are really timely and will shape the nation in terms of how it exploits its agricultural economy that is really the only shining light in a time of darkness caused by the pandemic. Agriculture also sort of is responsible for nearly the employment of half the population in this country. And so it's important that this sector receives the same sort of benefits that so many other sectors have received. Whether you look at ticketing in the railways, for example, it used to be a physical requirement to go to a railway station, stand in a long queue, and then buy your railway ticket. And this is precisely what is happening today in the APMC market yards. The buyer needs to go to the market yard, the seller needs to bring his produce there. They both need to wait a long time before the goods can be viewed and auctioned. And I think this just represents a very old process and very inefficient procedure that can be done away with. I think what the paradigm shift that the current set of ordinances really facilitates is for this physical, financial, and documentary layers to be separated out, which can only be done in private markets with, of course, the required infrastructure and the required legislative and regulatory oversight. And I think today, for the first time, we have most of that in place. And I think these ordinances have removed the last sort of obstructive elements, if you will, to making the efficient markets a reality.